Welcome to episode 54 of After the Breach podcast. We're your hosts, Jeff and Sarah. Ahoy, Sarah.
Hey, Jeff.
How's it going?
It's going great.
Excellent. We have a great episode today. We're going to be joined by John Calambokidis from Cascadia Research Collective, and we're going to be talking about the work that they do, and specifically, we're going to get into a lot of discussion on gray whales.
Yeah, they've been in the news a lot lately, and not for really a good reason.
Right. So it's a timely
a little
discussion.
bit somber, but an important discussion.
And I'm looking forward to, he always gives great information. I'm looking forward to learning quite a bit. So let's get John in here.
All right.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you joining us today.
Nice to see both of you.
Yeah, and for our listeners, John, if you don't mind, we know you, but if you would introduce yourself and Cascadia Research Collective that you work for, that would be great, so they can know more about you and Cascadia.
No, you bet. Yeah, so John Calambokidis, I'm one of the founders here of Cascadia Research, which we started in 1979, so 47 years into it at this point. We just celebrate our 45th. And Cascadia is a nonprofit tax-exempt research organization. We really started it to do scientific research on marine mammals that would address, I think, conservation needs. Our full name is Cascadia Research Collective because we also had a vision of trying to kind of be our own bosses, run it non-hierarchically, and we work primarily under contracts and grants to federal and state agencies, mostly NOAA on the federal side and various state conservation and wildlife organizations on the state or local side. You know, my career started with seals. Harbor seals were my first study subject in the mid-1970s, and then I want to say probably starting in the 1980s, started to focus a little more on cetaceans, harbor porpoise surveys, and then into large whales, gray whales, humpback whales, and blue whales, and I've been doing that for over 40 years. And, you know, a lot of our work, I would say, focuses on things like abundance, trends, different types of human impacts, from entanglements to ship strikes to underwater noise, things like we're active participants in the Marine Mammal Stranding Network, so we respond to strandings, do small boat surveys up and down the coast. We also have a Hawaii research program headed by Robin Baird that focuses on some of the Odontocetes in Hawaii. And we're about a little over a dozen kind of employees, plus additional graduate students and occasional volunteers and interns that work with us. We're based in Olympia, Washington, but our work is, we think of it more as the North Pacific primarily, and sometimes broader waters.
Yeah, amazing. I was just looking over the Cascadia website just to kind of re-familiarize myself with you, and you guys have a lot of amazing projects going on all over.
Yes, we do tend to get involved in a number of things. Yeah, we do, I should say, if you looked at different projects we're engaged in, we try to both, in our methodology, continue some long-term things like photo ID. We tried to maintain the long-term catalogs on the West Coast for gray whales, humpback whales, and blue whales. Have a long history of doing that, but also embrace new technologies as they become available from different types of tags that we've deployed. I think I've been involved in deploying something like 800 or more tags on different whale species, mostly suction cup attached archival tags, or use of drones to deploy tags or to collect samples and other things like that. So we also try to stay innovative. And the other part I would say we'd like to do a lot of is we'd like to engage in larger collaborations. So things like the SPLASH study, which was a study of humpback whales across the North Pacific and involved over 400 collaborators. We were engaged in and the main entity coordinating that. So those are some of the characteristics in the work we've done. But I'm sure as we drill down we can get into a little more detail on whether it's things like gray whales, which are very much in the news and at the forefront of some of our concerns right now.
Yeah, we're excited to talk to you about gray whales. This is our 54th episode, and we have yet to really dive into gray whale conversation.
And they're amazing animals, and I think an important time to spotlight them because of everything going on. And I know that you were recently speaking with Whale U, 50 Shades of Gray Whale for Monica's class, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you this afternoon.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, one of the interesting things about gray whales for me is our and my changed perspective on gray whales that's evolved over time. Both of them as, a species, the degree to which we think we understood them, where they stood in terms of recovery and their population status. All of these things, I think, have gone through dramatic changes with new insights. And I have sort of both a newfound appreciation, a newfound concern for gray whales. So it's a really appropriate time to think about them.
Yeah. Well, for those listening who may have come for, I say come for the orcas, stay for the gray whales, let's say. But do you mind introducing gray whales as a species and just kind of giving some information about them for our listeners?
You bet. And, gray whales are one of the baleen whales. They do occupy a unique family. And I would just say that, they stand out from some of the other baleen whales that filter feed in a few ways. They look different. They have a very varied coloration and skin pigment that includes light and dark pigment. They tend to have a lot of scars, barnacles, sometimes lice growths on them, so they can look like kind of a rock swimming through the water in some ways. They don't have a dorsal fin, but they have a dorsal hump with some knuckles after them. They have a fairly bushy blow. They're kind of an intermediate size baleen whale, so get up around 45 feet is the typical upper level size for them. So that's a little bit about their kind of characteristics and what they look like. Maybe because of their appearance, you'd sometimes see reference to them as a more primitive species, and I would say that's something that we certainly, and I've certainly changed my view and appreciation of. We viewed them as specialized feeders, and they do have a unique skill in specializing in feeding on organisms on the bottom. So going down to the bottom and sucking up sediment and creatures that live on the bottom, and that's certainly a specialty for them. But rather than think of them as specialized feeders, when you look at the wide variety of prey that has been documented for gray whales, they probably have to go down as one of the most versatile of the baleen whale species in terms of prey they go after. And they're certainly capable of skim feeding at the surface, lunge feeding in the water column, as well as feeding on the bottom. Their prey can include anything from different bottom and benthic amphipods to intertidal organisms like ghost shrimp, to swarming mysid shrimp, to herring larvae and herring spawn areas, feeding on herring spawn. I've seen them feeding on krill, even in amongst humpback whales and blue whales. So, wide variety of kind of ability to feed on things. But as we'll talk about, they're really reliant on those kind of benthic populations of prey as their kind of specialty. And the other thing that our changed view has really gone from is that for a long time they were viewed as the poster child of the success story of a recovering whale population coming back from whaling. And gray whales were a little bit unique in that they were hunted in, historical times by Native Americans. They were hunted in the early era of commercial whalings when it was still hand-thrown harpoons in the Yankee whaling days and Scammond's time. And they were also hunted in the modern era of commercial whaling, especially along the California coast. So they've been a target of whaling going back quite a bit. Their numbers probably reduced down to just a few thousand whales in the early 1900s, and then making this remarkable comeback, coming back to what was thought to be near their historical population, over 20,000 whales. And so we kind of viewed, okay, this is a success story. Everything's good with gray whales. And there too, we were wrong. Now it's emerging that since they went through this recovery, we've seen these boom bust cycles. That was actually the title of one of the papers that Josh Stewart recently authored that I was a part of. And now in the most recent years, a troubling precipitous decline. So anyway, that's a little bit kind of both going from appearance to hunting to conservation to our view of their basic biology, how gray whales have, our perspective on them has changed over time.
Sure. Well, thank you for that. And within the North Pacific, gray whales are now just in the Pacific Ocean. I think historically they were in the Atlantic as well. Is that correct? Long time ago.
Historically, they existed actually on both sides of the Atlantic. Evidence that they were even on the other side of the Atlantic. And in the early days of whaling in the kind of western North Atlantic, there still seemed to be some gray whales there. I think the whalers referred to them as the skag whale, but they seem to be on their way out, basically, and were eliminated.
Right.
And in the North Pacific, where they remain, there are at least two recognized populations, the eastern North Pacific population of gray whales, that is what we will be mostly talking about and was the bulk of the population. But there is also a western gray whale population. It's still considered endangered, but the story there is much more complicated than we thought it was as well, and lots of evidence that those whales come over here as well. And then we also have sort of the uncertain status of a group of whales we call the Pacific Coast Feeding Group that, rather than migrate to the Arctic to feeds in Pacific Northwest waters, numbers just a few hundred whales. And, by the IWC and the Canadian government is viewed as a more separate, distinct population, but under U.S. and, NOAA's classification is not treated as a distinct population, though I think it's...
And it's the sounders, so there's a dozen or so, maybe more now, gray whales that would be maybe a subgroup of this Pacific Coast Feeding Group?
Yes, the sounders gray whales are actually a portion of the eastern North Pacific population that migrates up to the Arctic, with most of the sounders whales being whales that basically stop off and feed for on the order of 3 or 4 months on their way back to the Arctic. So they're part of that larger eastern North Pacific population. But as with everything with gray whales, that's a little tricky. There's one sounder that actually is a PCFG whale and knows to also make use of that area. But he's a bit of an exception for that. And mostly the sounders, rather than being part of the PCFG, which you'd think they'd be because they feed in this area, turn out to be instead just stopping off for a short period of time. Though that's shifted a little bit in recent years with them staying longer, but still generally migrating north.
As far as the sounders go, when did they first start showing up in Puget Sound? I kind of view you and Cascadia as my gray whale foundation of knowledge. So I know you've been tracking these guys for a long time. When do we know when they started utilizing this area, kind of east of Whidbey Island, right around the Snohomish River Delta?
Right. And we first started studying gray whales and started our photo ID efforts in the early to mid 1980s. And initially we were focused on areas like the northern Washington coast and the Strait of Juan de Fuca. But we were also tracking, especially 1984 was a big year where we had quite a number of gray whales come into Puget Sound. And generally we viewed the whales that came into Puget Sound and identified were mostly these kind of stragglers from the migration that would come in for short periods of time. And it wasn't until 1990, that was the first year that we identified 2 gray whales up in the northern Puget Sound area. It was actually up near Port Susan. And the next year, 1991, we saw those exact same 2 whales and additional whales as well. So that's when we first became aware, 1990 and then really 91, when we saw the same whales come back, that this was something different. These weren't stragglers from the population that we generally don't see more than a year. And that was also the year that a graduate student at the University of Washington, Lori Whitecamp, was studying ghost shrimp, working with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And she was seeing in their surveys of these ghost shrimp beds in northern Puget Sound, the same area that we had seen these whales, these pits at low tide that were areas right in these ghost shrimp beds that she started to suspect, because she was seeing some of these gray whales, could these be the result of gray whale feeding? And she contacted me, and we became aware of, wow, these whales are not only returning year to year, it looks like they're targeting these intertidal ghost shrimp beds. And so in 1991, we identified 6 different whales. In 1992, we saw all 6 of those whales again.
Wow.
And okay, something has started here. And I've tried to go back. I've interviewed people, and I'm actually kind of working on trying to summarize, all of this evidence. Almost all of the evidence points to 1990 was the start of it. And the first 2 whales we saw that year, we named them Earhart and Shackleton. We gave them the numbers 21 and 22 because that's where we were in starting to add whales to our catalog. They were the 21st and 22nd whale we'd identified. The lower number whales were some of those numbers we'd identified in the Strait of Juan de Fuca and on the Washington coast, and the earlier research we'd done in the 1980s. And so we really became aware these were regular whales coming back, seen every spring. We started to target our surveys to look at it and see it. The people I interviewed up there, I would say almost all of them agreed that they had not seen whales in that area regularly prior to 1990. But I would say there was one very notable exception, a woman that had a house overlooking, I think, Mobana Beach. And I talked to her many years later, so I don't know if there's a chance maybe the years had gotten a little bit mixed up for her, but she insisted that she had seen whales feeding earlier than that. So there's some possibility of that being earlier. Now that I've really drawn the connection between when did new sounders come to this area, 1990-91 fits perfectly with a period where there was higher mortality of gray whales and a decline in the overall gray whale eastern North Pacific population. So it really matches with what we ended up seeing later, because in 1999-2000, 10 years later, we saw another influx of another 6 of these sounder whales join the original 6 to take us to 12. And that was in a year of higher mortality and declining population. And then this whole pattern repeated again in 2019, the most recent higher mortality period where we had a bunch of new whales. And now that I see how all 3 of those time periods fit together, it's convinced me all the more that 1990-91 was the start of the sounder whales. And you really think about how did these whales know to come to this spot and discover this high-risk feeding strategy going into the intertidal area at high tide when it would be high and dry at low tide, to exploit these ghost shrimp that were really dense in this intertidal area. And you really realize that it took some adventurous experimenting initial animals, but after that occurred, they're so social, and one of the first tags we deployed was on Earhart whale 22. And the tag had a video camera on it that perfectly filmed when she went into the shallows. She had 3 other whales follow right behind her into the shallows. And you could see how they could learn how to take advantage of this prey resource just by hanging out with some of these whales that had figured it out. And I think that's why we've seen these sounder gray whales grow. They went from a couple of pioneering animals to then other animals that came to that area, being able to learn from those animals. And that's what's allowed this to grow over time to now where we have some 20 sounder whales. We don't see all 20 every year. And we can get into a little bit about some of the fluctuations we see, but the number has steadily grown from those 2 to 6 to 12 and now closer to 20.
Wow.
That is like one of the coolest things in the ever. I mean, it is really amazing not just how they found this, but then how others learned. I mean, it really is. Wow is not enough.
Yeah, we don't always think of them as social. Baleen whales as social.
Yeah, and to personalize it a little bit more, another of those early whales, whale 44, which we call doveneck, was a whale that in 1991 we had repeated sightings as he swam around southern Puget Sound and central Puget Sound, and he kind of perfectly fit the model of these kind of stragglers wandering around looking for an area to feed. And then he ended up in northern Puget Sound in that area and ended up staying there the rest of the spring. And then in all the subsequent years, he would come straight to that area. And demonstrate to us, we saw this individual animal seemingly looking for alternative areas to feed. And then thanks to those other whales being there, saying, okay, here's a good spot. And maybe it's because gray whales feed on, a prey that doesn't swim around. It's in the sediment and it's at one spot. And maybe because they have to navigate the lagoons in Mexico and navigate up through Unimak Pass into the Bering Sea. I think they probably have a capability, and it was beneficial for them to have a capability to have this more precise sense of navigation than maybe many other whales have. And one of the figures I like to show it's actually pretty tricky for a whale to go from its migration pathway, along the Washington coast and up towards Vancouver Island. It's got to take that right turn down the Strait of Juan de Fuca. It's got to come all the way to the end of the straits. It's got to find that tiny entrance at Admiralty Inlet, which is really small. It's got to come south through that and then go around Whidbey Island and then turn north and then come up on the inside of Whidbey Island to get to this spot. And yet, once these whales learned this, they would do that. We wouldn't see them lots of other locations. And most of the locations we would have for sounder gray whales tend to be just as they're coming on that route or leaving by that route, and no longer it's not like they're doing some big search anymore. They're coming right to that spot. So we've sort of seen some of these animals transition from searching to now that they found it, they zero right in on it.
It's so amazing that, this isn't like some, just spot on the side of the road. Like, this is a very obscure place that they have to travel to, for people that aren't familiar with the area. I mean, it is really incredible that they're able to find it so well.
Absolutely.
And with the sounders, you kind of mentioned some shifting trends, but do we know sexes on some, all, probably not all, but some of the sounders is it mostly females, mostly males, and even split? Have we seen calves with them?
The sounders that we've, and we know sex mostly from collecting skin samples and having that determined genetically. And, the majority of the early sounders were males. And Earhart, whale 22, was one of our notable exceptions. She was a female. But in the most recent round of sex determinations, as the groups of sounders have expanded, it's not yet balanced. It's still primarily males, but we've gotten more and more females. It's become less strikingly male-dominated as it used to be. And now we do have, a handful of known females that are part of the sounders. And, regarding calves, one of the puzzling things that, for a while we scratched our heads on is that even though some of these were adult females that we would, see repeatedly, we never saw them with a calf. And we were seeing them in spring, which was, when, if they had a calf, they should still be with its calf. We estimate the weaning date for gray whales is like in July or August. So our sounder sightings are before they would be weaning that calf. And that's when we started to notice a pattern that was some of these females, and Earhart in particular, it seemed like every 2 to 5 or 6 years, we would not see her. She would skip a year and not come to northern Puget Sound. And that's where we began to get a hint. Oh, are those the years she's having a calf? And it was a question at first, but then Earhart was sighted on the Mexico breeding grounds with a calf in one of those years where she didn't come to northern Puget Sound. And then we had 2 other times where the photogrammetry that Holly Fernbaugh and John Durbin did identified as her being likely pregnant. And then it was in the following year that we did not see her.
That is so fascinating.
Then we ended up with these kind of clear indications. Okay, she does have calves, and when she has a calf, she doesn't come here. And the reasons for that, we don't know for sure, but mothers with calves tend to migrate later. They're at the tail end of the northern migration. So you could see maybe since the sounders are primarily feeding for, 2, 3, 4 months before they proceed to the Arctic, it could be it's not as worth making that deviation. Might as well go on to the Arctic if you're already migrating later, and maybe this is more anthropomorphic. Is there a realization that this would be a very dangerous place and a dangerous, type of high-risk feeding strategy to try to engage in if you had a closely associated calf that might get stuck, might get lost, might wander off, and not be in tune with those tides. We have tested, and we did wonder early on, are these sounders, maybe some of them are offspring or they're closely related to each other, but none of the genetics suggested there was a close relationship between them. So it didn't look like some of the sounders were offsprings of the sounders, much like we see in the PCFG whales, where we do see that internal recruitment. We don't see that with the sounders.
Wow, that's fascinating.
So interesting.
And you kind of answered my question, but have the sounders been photo ID'd anywhere else? So Earhart was seen down in the breeding grounds and the lagoons, but have any of the others been seen elsewhere along their migration path?
Yes, to a small degree. Not very extensive histories, but we have had occasional sightings of them in other areas. Sometimes it seems like when they're en route coming up or headed north on their migration, somewhat tragically, it was last year that one of the newer sounders that joined in recent years was sighted in San Francisco Bay ahead of when it was seen up here and ended up dying down there. It was one of the whales that they documented having died and washed up and having been a victim of a ship strike down there. So that was another sighting outside the region. So I was just looking at, unfortunately, we have these thousands of sightings and encounters of the sounder gray whale and just a small handful that are outside the region.
Sure. That makes sense.
Yes.
Well, it kind of leads into a good place. So how do we identify individual gray whales? Like I know with killer whales, we're looking at dorsal fins and saddle patches. There's unique markings on gray whales for sure, but what parts of the body are you guys looking at primarily for making those matches?
Well, we've had a series of people who have been fantastic at matching gray whales, for the last more than dozen years. Ali Perez here has been kind of our lead manager of the gray whale catalog and gray whale photo ID. And I find them rather tricky to ID, and I spend time with humpback whales and blue whales and others. And I think gray whales are tricky, especially if there's any gap, like if multiple years go by before you see an individual, it can look different because it's a combination of those coloration patterns, pigment patterns you have on the whales, scars and other markings that you have. And also extremely beneficial is that dorsal hump, and those knuckles tend to vary in how prominent they are, what shape they are, and the spacing between them is also distinctive. So using a combination of those factors is what we focus on for, the photo identification and tracking. But even among the sounder gray whales, if you take, photographs from 15, 20 years ago of a whale and you try to match it to that whale today without the benefit of all the photographs in between, that show the, transition and changes and addition and scars. The pigment patterns stay the same, but other markings, change and vary. And I think it can be very tricky as well to make those long-term, connections with animals. So it takes a skilled eye. And gray whales sometimes get these films of other growths on their side, or the type of lighting that you're dealing with can make them much lighter or much darker. So you have a number of things that can also fool you.
Sounds like a challenge.
For sure.
But Cascadia, I was looking through, everything. I was trying to kind of do a deep dive on this as deep as I could. But you've identified over 2,000 individual gray whales in this Eastern Pacific group. Is that right?
Yes. Well, our focus in our catalog and our efforts have been around the whales that are part of the PCFG, the Pacific Coast Feeding Group. Mm-hmm. So we tend to focus on Northern California through British Columbia as our region, and especially the whales that are there through the summer and fall, as well as the sounder whales or the whales that come into Puget Sound. And for a long time, we were reluctant to try to turn this into a North Pacific-wide catalog.
Sure.
Because even with 2,500 plus whales in our catalog currently, to search for a new whale, and we'll get into some of the algorithms and automated match recognition that is now going to help this process. But before that, that could take many hours, even just with a catalog of, 2,500 whales. And so we were aware if that expanded to 20,000 whales, that would just be very difficult to conduct by hand. And so that's why we really focused on the Pacific Coast Feeding Group. And that was one of the central purposes for our catalog, especially in early years, was to try to generate an estimate of how big was the Pacific Coast Feeding Group of whales, that stays through the spring, summer, and fall feeding. And that was especially relevant because in the late 1990s, the macaw tribe was proposing resuming their historical hunt of gray whales. And there was concern about, well, what if that took some of the PCFG whales, killing 5 whales might not be very many for the overall population of 10, 20,000. But if that's out of a small population of a few hundred, that could be significant. So we wanted a way to both estimate that Pacific Coast Feeding Group and track them related to that. And it created a reason why, NOAA was very interested in maintaining a Pacific Coast Feeding Group catalog and a way to track their population and identify individuals that were or were not part of this Pacific Coast Feeding Group.
And I could be totally wrong with this, John, so feel free to correct me. But was it during that time that we kind of first realized that maybe there were some whales coming from the Western Pacific and migrating down along this coast and down to the breeding lagoons?
Yes, and I really have to maybe give credit. We knew about the Western gray whales. There was a long-term photo ID effort being conducted by 2 different research groups with the Western gray whales, especially those that fed right off Sakhalin Island, the main area they feed in the Sea of Okhotsk in Russia. We had not endeavored to try to match our whales to those catalogs. And then there was an effort to satellite tag those Western gray whales to look at where was their winter breeding area, because it was thought to be maybe somewhere in the Western North Pacific off China or south of Korea or near Korea. And there was an initial animal that was named, got given the name Flex, tagged by Bruce Mate and Oregon State University. Mm-hmm. And that whale, they satellite tagged it on the feeding ground. And instead of heading south to reveal where its winter ends, it started to come east. And it crossed across the North Pacific, actually kind of making a beeline for Washington State is where it actually hit the U.S. West Coast and then migrated south from there. Wow. And as it was a little over halfway across, and we were kind of tracking this and in touch with the people doing that work, we started to think, we ought to be looking at these whales. And the very first whale we looked at was Flex. because that was the whale that was satellite tagged. And lo and behold, Flex was in our catalog.
Wow.
So it was like, look at this. This whale actually has visited Washington State, and he had been sighted and identified in a year, apparently when he was northbound, actually coming back from the Mexico breeding lagoons and before heading across the Pacific back to the Sea of Okhotsk area. And, now there have been efforts to expand that, and I think now we're up to, I think, 20 or 30 matches between known Western gray whales and the Eastern North Pacific, and especially it may be even higher if you include any of the matches to just the breeding lagoons in Mexico. It may be up to 35, 40, but that's something that, has still confounded how we should treat the Western gray whales. They were treated as a unique population, treated as endangered, a surviving remnant that had not recovered, subject to, there was oil exploration going on in those areas. And so there was a lot of concern. There were genetic studies that even showed their DNA patterns, differed statistically from the overall Eastern North Pacific genetic patterns, suggesting they weren't just a random selection of animals from the Eastern North Pacific. And that still remains, I would say, a very puzzling finding. How should we treat these Western gray whales? Subsequently, a number of other whales have been satellite tagged, and there was only a small number that have been satellite tagged, but all of them that a migration was documented for came over here to the Eastern North Pacific. None of them made this migration south to these anticipated breeding grounds off China. But yet we know historically they used to go down there, and there are things like occasional sightings of gray whales off Japan and areas that make you think there is maybe still some remnant population. But now we're sort of wondering, well, what happened? Did those whales switch their behavior? Did that endangered population still exist, but now Eastern North Pacific gray whales have come and colonized that area, and that's part of that group? It still remains a bit of a mystery how to treat the Western gray whales.
Wow, that's just so fascinating.
It's amazing. I'm learning so much. I'm learning that I really didn't know much about gray whales.
I feel the same way all the time.
I just feel like I could ask so many questions about this, but in the interest of time and your time, as you're kind of like working through this, are there, I saw the video tags that you deploy, the suction cup tags, was so fascinating to me. Are there projects that you're working on or would like to see done with gray whales in the future? You kind of mentioned like potentially machine learning for identification, but are there other things that you'd like to see done surrounding gray whales?
And maybe this is the right time to cut to the somewhat tragic part of gray whale story, because I think then that'll put some of this other kind of the directions we need to go and are going into. And, the troubling part of what's happened with gray whales is that we've now seen not only these continued mortality events that I think, first were documented in the early 1990s, then 1999, 2000, then most recently starting in 2019. And that's what led us to think, okay, maybe gray whales have bounced back to the carrying capacity of their food supply. And now that they're there, they're more subject to the fluctuations of their prey, causing them to go through these more downturns and recoveries. And, in the paper Josh Stewart, wrote that a number of us participated in, it, kind of put forth maybe this is the new normal. But what's changed now is this mortality event that began in 2019, instead of just being a year or two long, followed by a recovery of gray whales, has just continued. And even though the unusual mortality event we thought ended in 2023, it really has just continued. And what we're seeing this year, 2026, is, if anything, even more alarming than what we saw at the start of this mortality event. And Southwest Fisheries Science Center does these counts of gray whales based on the number of gray whales migrating south past the spot just south of Monterey Bay. And they do these regular counts. They extrapolate for animals traveling offshore. They estimate how many are migrating by at night or before or after their monitoring period. And they come up with a whole population estimate for the Eastern North Pacific population. And that's been going on for over 50 years. It has shown this great recovery of gray whales. Then this middle period of fluctuations, boom-bust cycles. And unfortunately, most recently, it's told us a tragic tale that since just before 2019, we've seen the abundance estimates decline by over 50% in the last 10 years, going from a high of 27,000 in the late 2010s to the most recent estimate last year at 13,000. So less than half what it had been, and representing some of the lowest populations we'd seen, lower than the population had gotten in any of those other recent mortality events. So both the duration, number of animals, the estimated population, has made this stand out as not just part of some cyclical pattern. Combined with that, they estimate the number of calves born by a count of the calves migrating northbound along the California coast from the breeding lagoons. And the count of calves last year, for the first time in all of their monitoring of calf counts, was under 100, whereas it had been sometimes well over 1,000 calves estimated born to this population. And that was their lowest number of calves born. And then as a third thing, what we've seen here with strandings in Washington state. Through the end of April, we had 17 gray whales wash up dead in Washington state. And we have one of the longer track records, almost 50 years of monitoring gray whale strandings in Washington state. And never had we had 17 by the end of April, just for that first part of the year. Typically, May is our peak mortality. Mm-hmm. And the biggest year we had ever had previous to that in terms of mortality through the end of April was 2019, when we had 11. So here we were over 50% higher number of strandings through the end of April of the highest year we had ever had. And that mortality in 2019 was when the population was thought to be twice as big as what it is now. So to have this 50% higher mortality than your record year when the population is less than half what it was, that spells real trouble. So all of those factors, the strandings, the abundance estimates, the calf counts, are really pointing towards this, very, very concerning and precipitous, decline and crisis that gray whales are facing. Many of the gray whales we see seem to be exploring and searching for new areas to feed. We have whales in a number of areas that look emaciated, and I think we know we're going to get additional mortalities. We can hope that maybe this year the pattern through the year is just occurring earlier, and we won't get to the sort of numbers that you would extrapolate. If it occurs at the same rate as it occurs in previous years, we would expect, to see mortalities closer to 50 gray whales by the end of the year. And so we're hopeful we're not going to see that this is occurring earlier. And maybe we've seen the slightest hopeful hint that maybe it's tapered off a little bit from the rate it was occurring at in late April, where it seemed like we were getting a stranding every day or every other day of gray whales. But it's really had us worried about how gray whales, are doing and their future.
Sure.
And the cause of this, which is, of course, the first, why is this occurring? And the sounders and the PCFG and the Western gray whales give us a little bit of an insight, because those three groups of whales all either feed in other areas or supplement their feeding by feeding in other areas, compared to the main gray whale population that primarily feeds in the Arctic. Mm-hmm. And those three groups of whales don't seem to be experiencing the high mortality that we're seeing in the main part of the population. So that's what's really telling us that the cause of the issue is the prey in the food supply in the Arctic, because the whales that feed elsewhere or supplement their feeding by feeding elsewhere don't seem to be having as much of a problem. Many of the gray whales that die look really emaciated and thin. That can be a little tricky because this is the time of year that we would expect them to be at their thinnest because they've just gone through a 3 to 4 month fast. But rather than just being maybe normally thin as they head back to their feeding grounds, some of these whales are running out of their reserves, and that's why they're dying. This is the time of year they'd be under the maximal stress and nutritional pressure. And it's really an indication that they didn't get enough to feed last year and the previous year, that they're unable to survive this normal period of fasting. And so that's why we think the heart of the problem, is changes in the Arctic that have caused the decline in the benthic food supply that gray whales rely on. And up there, there's not a ton of research up in the Arctic, and especially on benthic populations, but some of that work done by researchers like Jackie Grebmeyer and Sue Moore have shown that some of the areas gray whales used to heavily feed, where there used to be dense benthic prey for them, now have much less prey and much fewer gray whales, staying there. And the gray whales are searching other areas and searching further north as ice cover recedes, looking for alternate areas to feed, but clearly not being successful as they were in the past.
Right, and as they colonize or not colonize, but explore these areas looking for potentially other prey, other prey resources that could lead them into, potentially other threats where that, not familiar with the environment, as you mentioned, like with these sounders coming in who are like working in an intertidal zone or into areas where there might be other factors that come into play, or even going so far as into the Atlantic where, they don't have the knowledge of the, food areas to feed in.
Yes. And a number of gray whales that die, whether here in Washington or in areas like San Francisco, they do often show signs of other human threats. Indications of what we call blunt force trauma, which looks most commonly, we suspect, is the result of things like vessel or ship strikes or entanglements in fishing gear. And all of that makes sense. If whales, used to just migrate past, but now they're searching new areas for alternate areas to feed, coming into more coastal areas and embayments like San Francisco Bay, like Willapa Bay, like Grays Harbor. They're actually encountering more vessel traffic, more fishing activities, and would face greater vulnerability to these other threats as well. And, some of these whales that show this blunt force trauma also are emaciated. So we can see that they were probably facing that challenge and searching, for alternate areas to feed before they faced things like ship strikes.
Sure.
We also think that explains some of the really strange areas some of these whales have ended up. Part of, what came into the news in early April was a whale that swam up the Willapa River, a small river that feeds into Willapa Bay. It seemed like a really strange area to have a whale swam up, and it actually ended up far up the river. And we think some of those whales, partly that's a desperate search for areas to feed, but we've also seen this in past years where you'll get whales that as they face this nutritional crisis and running out of their reserves, they get into a debilitated state and they look disoriented. They look unaware of their surroundings. I've been out even like in a Coast Guard boat with one of these live swimming, starving whales, and it literally just swam up and ran into the boat like it wasn't even aware of its surroundings. So some of that may be as they hit kind of a desperate level that they lose their ability to navigate, or have their full senses, and it can be really tragic that way.
John, going back to the food in the Arctic and the prey issue and areas where their prey used to be abundant and we're not seeing it, is this a climate change issue? Do we have any kind of handle on what's happened in those areas?
Yes, and to me, I was always very, reluctant to jump to that conclusion quickly, because in the context of when gray whales were still recovering and coming back, you might expect that they'd face some prey challenges as that population reaches the limit of the carrying capacity that would likely be driven by their prey. Sure. And that's why in the initial context of these fluctuations and boom-bust cycles, I was a little more reluctant to point to climate change then. But now that we've seen this prolonged period, the population down to less than half what it should be, and it's still suffering, that's clearly part of a longer term, more serious trend than just up and down normal fluctuations. And the Arctic has seen this high level of ecosystem change driven, by global warming, receding ice cover that's changed current patterns, changed sediment disposition. It's changed water temperatures along the bottom. So it's had these broad effects up there that kind of cause, issues. And while we don't understand all of the intricacies of those dynamics, it does seem clearly related to that climate change caused ecosystem, changes occurring in the Arctic. And we need to learn a lot more about that. It's bizarre right now that among some of the, major cutbacks in government funding, U.S. federal government funding, is basically anything that tries to address climate change or research or investigate climate change is treated as, off the table and not considered for funding right at this moment when we critically need it. So we're reliant and benefit from some of the work done by people like Jackie Grebmeyer, but we need to be able to do kind of more work on that to understand it better. But it is clearly being driven by that. I do want to point out that, whales still die as the result of ship strikes and entanglements and these other human activities. And there is important progress that can be made on those. But at the heart of this issue is both understanding and addressing that huge change going on in the Arctic ecosystem due to climate change.
Yeah, I mean, it seems complicated, and at the same time, it seems obvious, what is, the big crux of the issue here. But I guess I would hate to leave our listeners feeling hopeless. Is there something that we can do? Is there something that we can look to take any positive message to keep the momentum up and getting involved, staying aware, being active, that kind of thing, John?
No, absolutely. And I think, it is the kind of wonderful thing about the Sounders gray whales, because they do represent one way that this species and population that turns out to be way more versatile and adaptive and flexible than we thought it was, has learned to survive. And those whales, have learned to prosper and do well. And, I think the Sounders more than anything represent, a way that I think gray whales have a path to survive. The troubling part is there isn't prey for thousands of gray whales in northern Puget Sound. It's a way for elements of the population to be able to survive through this challenge. But, it probably still doesn't alleviate a huge consequence to the overall population.
Right.
So what can we be doing in the interim here to help support them and your efforts and the efforts of others to help gray whales through this?
Yeah, no, there's a series of things, and I do think, the sounder gray whales, we put a proposal in, for example, the CDOC Society, to specifically look at how to protect the areas the sounders use, so seize on the fact we have this group of whales that has found an alternate way to survive this crisis. How can we reduce the threats from vessel strikes? We've had several of the sounders be hit by boats. Can we restrict boat speeds in areas where there's high sounder activities? Educate boaters to be on the lookout for things. It was actually, Earhart that was struck a number of years ago by a boat, and fortunately she survived that. But learning to recognize if there are whale watch boats in the area, That's probably a good indication. If you're in your personal boat, you should slow down and not go at a high speed. It probably means there's whales in the area. We're trying to ramp up our efforts on identifying causes of entanglements and conflicts with kind of fishing gear, training up more responders. The Whale Museum is now getting a core group of more experienced entanglement responders to kind of aid in freeing whales and getting data when they do become entangled. We're working much more closely with fishing groups and with WDF&W to identify fisheries that cause entanglement and what modifications can be made to reduce entanglement. So supporting and encouraging your state agencies and your representatives to support those efforts. So partly it's protect the sounders. Those are all key things, we can do. And we had so many people and so much concern in this country about climate change and actions we can reduce carbon emissions and take the steps necessary to reduce our contribution to climate change. That on a personal level, we all probably know people and have family members that maybe were in the camp of thinking, oh, climate change, A, is it real? Is it a hoax? B, is it really caused by humans? C, is it that big a concern if sea levels rise by a few inches? What is that going to cause? We'll find ways to deal with it in the future. And I think gray whales give us an insight into the fact, no, it is real. It's happening now. This is an advance warning. We can heed, and its consequences can be severe. And this is a chance to communicate. We in the Pacific Northwest, we tend to be a little more aware of that, but reaching out to your friends and family outside this area, to have those discussions of what we're seeing here and that this is a concern. Everyone loves whales. That's something, that people can appreciate and relate to and understand that this is a serious consequence. So those are all things that, we can be doing. To whatever degree we can change the politics, I know that's hard to do, but there are steps obviously we can do, whether that's in our area or supporting efforts. There's a movement voter project that tries to, target races where it's going to make a bigger difference in other parts of the country that can change the politics of this country. I'd love to see the United States get back to being a leader on climate change issues globally, because it's something we have to solve globally, rather than being, the main denier of it right now. And I try to tailor my language when I'm talking to someone in Canada or a different country, and I suddenly feel like I have to be more apologetic about our country. Sorry, you guys are doing great, but we're trying to change it here. But we have to kind of keep that mission in mind as well. You can see we need, like, the federal agency, NOAA, that manages marine mammals, is responsible for enforcing the Marine Mammal Protection Act, is the agency that manages the marine sanctuaries, is who is responsible for permitting and law enforcement, and things like fishery or ship strike impacts on whales is NOAA. Staffing levels in the cutbacks that NOAA faced and the forced retirements, my understanding is the West Coast staff of NOAA is down 30 to 40% in the last year and a half. What people might not realize, because Congress has actually appropriated some of NOAA funding levels at some of their 2024 levels, but from the executive branch, NOAA is being prevented from spending some of their funds. They can't let contracts or grants for over $100K without the sign off of the Secretary of Commerce. And, we have multiple proposals to continue some of this research that are just, they're not like they're rejected. They may have been recommended for funding and just exist in some kind of limbo land where no one knows what's happened to them or whether they'll be funded or not be funded. And so just through kind of inaction and restricting NOAA from being able to do its job and support research, we've seen real problems in our ability to keep studying and documenting some of these tragic developments with gray whales.
Sure. Well, I mean, in some ways, those actions can be good because it's not limited to people who are here in the Pacific Northwest. So, like getting out to vote in the midterm elections and looking at who might help move us forward into the direction we need to go is really going to be vital, and that can be done from anywhere in the U.S. So that's an important thing, I think, to think about too.
Yeah, and it is especially important to note that whales are impacted by our politics.
Yeah, and the gray whales certainly seem to be like almost a canary in the coal mine for climate change and for this, what's happening. I
do have one question that we didn't get to yet, and it kind of goes into the theme of the resiliency and the exploration of new areas. In the past few years, there have been sightings of gray whales in the Atlantic. I'm curious your take if you think, are these Pacific gray whales that are ending up over the top looking for new places, and they're ending up in the Atlantic? I mean, there have been sightings in Florida. There have been sightings like in Israel and Spain and Morocco. Yeah.
Yeah, all sorts of areas, Mediterranean, all parts of the Atlantic. And unfortunately, none of those gray whales seem to have prospered or found a great place to feed. We don't know the exact route they're taking to get there. We suspect it might be going through now the more accessible Northern Passage due to the less ice. And as there's been less ice, gray whales have had to explore further into the Arctic, searching for prey, so it would make sense some of those would make it into new areas they're unfamiliar with, and then might end up coming back the wrong way, taking them into new waters. Unfortunately, we don't see much of that as a hopeful sign, in the sense that those whales seem to just wander through the area, don't seem to have found productive, feeding grounds and prospered, but it does maybe reflect one part of gray whale resiliency in that they are at least trying to find alternate areas to feed.
This has been amazing. I've learned so much. But we want to give you a chance to, if there's anything you want to add, we'll definitely post links to Cascadia in the show notes so that people can check out more of your work and support your work.
Yes, and I will say, with the changes in government funding, and we have made a bigger push to seek private support and donations. You'll see more evidence on our website. We do now issue a newsletter on a regular basis that updates people on our activities, and stepped up our social media posts as well. Our website has traditionally been, I think, more a resource for maybe a little more scientists. All of our publications are listed. We tend to have 20, 30, 40 publications a year that come out, and you can download the full PDF of those articles and access all of those publications through our website, which is maybe of more use to scientists than others. But, we do try to put more stories, and you'll see different ways that you can participate, assist, and help now, in our efforts on our website. So I encourage people to go there, take a look, access some of our resources. If you want to know more about the sounders, we have more things like even sounders playing cards that have information on the sounders you can download, and there are little tidbits like that. Awesome. And that you can get to. So I urge people to look at that and tap into that.
Perfect. Well, we will definitely link to that. And we like to ask everybody this, and if you would like to, then great. But is there any memorable encounter you've had with whales that you'd like to share, something that keeps you inspired by whales to do the work you're doing?
Well, I would probably be hard pressed to think of the one, because I do feel myself incredibly fortunate to have had these experiences. I mean, the part that I think feels really privileged is both with humpback whales, with blue whales, and now with especially sounder gray whales, the chance that, some of these whales I've seen for 35, 40 years,
wow.
Running into that same whale and feeling, fortunate to be able to have that kind of a long-term connection to whales. It can feel most dramatic with the sounders, because you can be actually seeing it just tens or hundreds of yards from where you saw it 35 years ago.
Sure.
That's amazing.
It's kind of the exact same place and situation. So I do feel incredibly fortunate for that. And I think the other thing that I feel really privileged to have is that as new tools open up and become available, whether it's, automated matching algorithms to speed our ability to match gray whales, which is for the first time opening up the possibility of now creating an Eastern North Pacific wide catalog to let us estimate the abundance of gray whales by an alternate technique using photo ID and mark recapture. That would be really valuable because then that could be a tool to understanding how many whales are using these alternate feeding areas and which areas are they being successful and surviving in versus which areas are not, which is important information for us to have. It's exciting to be able to bring and see those new tools developed or new tag types, or for the first time a few years ago, actually being able to deploy our suction cup tags from drones and drop them rather than have to approach. So I also feel like it's an exciting time to study whales, to not only have that historical continuity, but also the chance to get new insights with these new tools and collaborate with new people that are skilled in these things. So I would maybe put that as my most memorable, part of being able to do this work.
I love it.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you, John, so much for your time and for chatting with us and sharing your wealth of knowledge with us.
Yeah, thank you so much, John.
You bet. It's been a pleasure talking to both of you. Thank you.
Wow, I'm overwhelmed. Like, I learned so much. I knew I didn't know about gray whales, but I really didn't know about gray whales.
No, they're so amazing. I mean, I felt like I had a pretty solid baseline on what I knew about gray whales, but it really was just like the tip of the iceberg, and I haven't even realized like the enormity of it, I don't think.
I think even though they're obviously going through a really rough time, but I'm a little hopeful based on how resilient they are. And I didn't really realize that resiliency, and maybe there's some hope there.
Yeah, and just like kind of reinforces like how important it is to keep the conversation up about them and about what's happening and these broader things, that are going on in climate change and how that impacts whales, because we don't always think about it from that context.
We don't, and we don't have like that direct connection like we do with what's going on now. Mm-hmm. We haven't really had that, but we do now, to be able to talk about that and really understand.
Yeah, and John brought it up, and I think it's a good point to reinforce too here, guys. We're kind of, by the time this airs, it'll be like the end of May, early June. Boating season is underway. So if you are out on the water and you see the whale flag,
or whale watching boats,
be aware. If you see a whale that is entangled or looks like it's in distress, it is a great thing to report that. And I think there's the ability to report on Cascadia's website, probably phone numbers, stranding networks. So we'll link to those things in the show notes, but really critical not to try to disentangle a whale yourself. So just kind of a good reminder as we're heading into the boating season, like be aware, be whale wise. And if you see a whale that you think needs help, to report it and not try to help it yourself.
No, definitely. And we'll link to the Cascadia website, and you can report through there.
But what a great conversation. Like,
he's
heartbreaking,
always,
but also really amazing.
And he's always fascinating to listen to.
Yes.
I've seen a few presentations of his, and it's always amazing.
Always.
And we'll be back with another episode soon. We're going to go through some spring highlights from our time on the water.
Yep.
And in the meantime,
we have a photo workshop in September. I know Jeff was going for the sign-off there, but we do have a photo workshop at the end of September, the 26th and 27th.
A little bit of space left.
Yeah, just a few seats left. 2 full days on the water. I say photo workshop, but really it's just like hang out with Jeff and I and go see as many whales as we can, and I'm happy to help you with your photo settings and taking photos of whales and wildlife. But it's a lot of fun, and yes, just a few seats left.
And it's such a great time to be out here.
It is our favorite month, though spring is.
It's been
amazing.
I'm excited to do our spring highlight episode because this has been off the hook.
Yeah. But anyway, reach out to us if you'd like to get more information or sign up for that. And now, Jeff, in the meantime,
stay safe out there.